Hello and welcome to a socially distanced edition of Expert Answers. I'm Paul Blake in Washington, D.C., and today's episode is all about global education. Specifically, the impact of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic on global education. As you may know, around the world, schools are being shuttered as countries work to slow the spread of COVID-19. But it leaves students out of classrooms, and it begs the question, how do we educate children during a crisis? Well, to get an answer to that and other key questions about dropout rates, school meals, and distance learning, I had the chance to speak to the World Bank Group's Global Director for Education, Jaime Saavedra, from his home in Lima, Peru. Jaime, thank you so much for being here. I want to ask, in the short term, there's been a lot of focus on the health impacts. Can you talk a little bit about how global education has been impacted? Give us a sort of global overview.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Look, we're living a huge crisis. As of now, as you were saying, more than 80% of children and young people who should be in school are not in school. 173 countries have closed their institutions. The vast majority completely shuttered. And we have almost 1.6 billion children who are out of school. This is a huge crisis.
You were the education minister in Peru. I mean, I'm sure you've seen different, big stops and problems in education. Like, how would you characterize this moment for global education?
So interruptions in the education process, I mean, sometimes happen. I mean, there could be a natural disaster. It could be there could be a strike. So that has happened, but it has never happened in this magnitude globally. And remember that we were already living a learning crisis pre-COVID. We were saying that in the low and middle income countries, only 53% of children were able to read and understand a text by age 10. And in addition to that, now we have a long interruption in the schooling process. So that crisis will be deepened.
One of the things we're seeing, I think, certainly here in the US, high-income countries, is this relatively easy transition to online learning. I mean, have you seen the same in low and middle income countries? Have they been able to make that same transition? Now,
I would challenge the view that in richer countries, this has been easy. I don't think it has been easy anywhere. If we go to middle and lower income countries, the situation is much, much more complicated. The fraction of students who will have our device and will have the bandwidth and connectivity that is needed is relatively small.
That must create a huge kind of equity issue then, right? Between the sort of the haves and have-nots of the internet become the haves and have-nots of education.
Correct. So we knew that there was a digital divide. Now, that digital divide is creating a potentially extreme impact on inequality of opportunities. So that's why many countries, what they're thinking is a multi-platform approach to remote learning. We need to be very creative, use all possible means, but with that idea that we need to reach everyone.
Jaime, you've written a blog on the World Bank website, and in that one point you raise is student dropout rate. Explain the dropout concern here.
Students, particularly secondary education students or students who are attending now tertiary education, will not come back to the system. Because, I mean, this is going to be a huge economic shock. So families might not have resources, or some will have to resource to work. Others will just the fact that they are disconnected for such a long time, right? And might have been students who were in the brink of dropping out, then they will.
Now, the sudden stop of schools is also having some knock-on effects that we might not immediately think about. What happens to the students who depend on schools for food? Can you talk a little bit about the sort of nutritional impact of the school stoppage and just how big of a concern that is for you?
The last numbers that I've seen is about 300 million children who receive their main meal at school, right? And that has been suddenly interrupted. So many countries are trying to find ways of compensating that, either through cash transfer programs or trying to make sure that they can receive those that food through different other mechanisms. It could be even sending it at home. But that is something that countries should emphasize.
There's been a lot of concern about recessions and that sort of thing. How quickly do you think global education will recover after the pandemic sort of passes, or the worst of the pandemic globally passes?
First of all, there's going to be a squeeze in public budgets in general, right? And we have seen in other crises that might have an impact, right, on social sector expenditures, including education. At the same time, the families will have less resources, right, to invest in education, either in tertiary education or in the cases in which you still have to pay fees. I mean, there will be a lower disposable income, and education might suffer. Third, you will have, in that same context in which public budgets are going to be squeezed, in many countries, you're going to see a shift of enrollments from private sector to the public sector, which is free, right? Because families will not have resources to pay for private education in those countries in which there is a sizable share of private education.
Jaime, we've over the past few minutes laid out a fairly bleak picture for education around the world in the wake of the pandemic. Now, there is some signs of hope. The World Bank has recently announced this kind of large-scale financial support package, up to $160 billion in financial support for countries fighting the pandemic over 15 months. Can you talk a little bit about what the education team is doing to support countries in the face of the pandemic?
So at this stage, the main support to countries and the work that all our teams are really focused on is on the coping strategies. A lot working precisely in that design and technical assistance related to and support related to designing and implementing those remote learning multi-platform strategies that we were talking before. Things will start shifting as time passes. I mean, more focus on scholarships, on demand-side interventions, and then support countries in that recovery phase.
Jaime Saavedra, thank you so much for joining us from Lima, Peru.
Thank you.
Jaime Saavedra is the Global Director for Education at the World Bank. If you want to learn more about the World Bank's response to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, head on over to worldbank.org/coronavirus and be sure to follow all of our social media accounts. In the meantime, stay safe, continue to socially distance. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.